Jasmine attacked Arnold's past, not knowing he'd once erased hers to protect her future. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The lights came up on a studio built for confrontation, not conversation. Polished glass floors reflected the stage like a courtroom made for television. The banner above them read, Reclaiming Justice, Education, Power, and the Generational Divide. Jon Stewart adjusted his blazer and smiled at the camera, but the tension in the air wasn't waiting for him to speak. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far left of the crescent table, hands folded, eyes locked forward, posture rigid with purpose. Her suit was clean-cut, sharp, unapologetically bold in color. She wasn't here to play the role of rising voice. She already had a voice, and tonight she intended to use it. Next to her, the seat was left deliberately empty for effect. And then Arnold Schwarzenegger entered the studio. He walked without a smile. He wasn't slow, but he wasn't in a hurry to reach the table either. His tailored black suit blended with the shadows behind him. There was no flash of celebrity, no hint of nostalgia. Just weight, age, presence, silence. When he sat, the chair didn't creak. He looked at no one, but saw everyone. The third guest, a child psychologist and school reform advocate, nodded politely to both. No one acknowledged it. This wasn't panel. It was a fault line. Jon opened. Tonight, we're talking about public education, punishment, and protection. And the question we want to ask is, who did the system really fail? He turned to Jasmine. Congresswoman, I want to begin with you. What does justice look like when you're 12 years old, sitting in a public school hallway, after being suspended for fighting back? She didn't blink. It looks like a locked door, Jon. It looks like silence. It looks like the faces of administrators who don't see a scared little girl, but a problem to be removed. The audience murmured, agreement, maybe memory. Jasmine continued. When I was 12, I got suspended for protecting my younger cousin in the cafeteria. He was being spit on. I stepped in. I pushed the kid, and I got 3 weeks out. My mom had to work double shifts to keep me out of the system. That's what justice looked like. Jon nodded. And what do you say to those who argue that policies at the time, like zero tolerance, were designed to create safety? She didn't hesitate. They weren't designed for safety. They were designed for simplicity. People like me were never considered worth the complexity. Then she turned, fully now, for the first time, to face Arnold. And those policies didn't write themselves. They were signed by men in suits, men like you. The silence thickened. The camera cut to Arnold, who didn't move. He looked at her without expression. Not cold, not challenged. Just there. Jasmine leaned in slightly. You cut funding to after-school programs in zip codes like mine. You let entire school districts rot so the state budget could look balanced. And we paid for it. In dropouts. In detentions. In dead ends. Still, Arnold didn't speak. Jon looked at him. Governor, that's a strong statement. Would you like to respond? Arnold's eyes stayed on Jasmine. His voice came low, measured. Which school? Jasmine frowned. Excuse me? Arnold repeated. You were 12. Which school? She blinked. Mark Twain Middle School. Dallas ISD. He nodded once. Just once. Then sat back. Jon glanced at the audience. Then at Jasmine. The crowd didn't know what to do with that moment. Neither did she. Jasmine's voice lowered but didn't soften. You think naming the school makes it better? That I'm going to feel seen now? No. You don't get to humanize it in retrospect. Arnold didn't respond. Jon pivoted. Let's talk policy, then. Governor, when you were in office, your administration was heavily criticized for eliminating several community-based educational grants. Some of those programs directly impacted schools, like Mark Twain. Did you believe at the time those cuts were necessary? Arnold answered without pause. Yes. That one word stopped the conversation cold. No elaboration, just a fact delivered like a verdict. Jasmine scoffed. And there it is. She turned back to the audience. This is what the system always does. It puts people in power who never sat in the hallway, who never knew what it's like to be 12, angry, and invisible. who only learned to see value once a camera pointed at them. She faced Arnold again. You don't know us. You never did. Arnold still didn't speak. John shifted. Governor, you look like you have something to say. Arnold looked up. His voice stayed level. I know exactly who I saw. The room didn't react. Yet, but something in the phrasing lingered, like the echo of a gunshot no one had heard, but everyone felt. Jasmine tilted her head slightly. You want to clarify that? Arnold didn't blink. No. And in that moment, before anything had been explained, before any reveal, before any defense, something changed. Not because he resisted her accusations, but because he didn't. Because he didn't push back, didn't explain, didn't unravel the tension. He let it build, and that is when the audience leaned forward, because they suddenly realized this man wasn't quiet out of guilt. He was waiting. She thought he was just another rich politician, until he named the girl she once tried to destroy. The air in the studio didn't crackle. It thickened, not with noise, but with restraint. Jasmine sat forward slightly now, sensing something in Arnold's refusal that wasn't cowardice. It was weight, a pressure she hadn't calculated. John Stewart looked between them, unsure whether to nudge the conversation forward or let it burn slower. Jasmine recovered quickly, shifted her tone from righteous to surgical. Let's talk specifics. Governor Schwarzenegger, during your administration, over 50 after-school programs in working-class districts were defunded. Kids lost access to meals, mentorship, and mental health support. That's not theory. That's harm. Arnold looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to John and spoke with the same stillness as before. May I show something? John hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. Of course. Arnold reached inside his inner jacket pocket and removed a single folded paper. He set it on the table in front of him but didn't unfold it. His hand remained on top of it. Jasmine watched. So did the audience. The camera zoomed slightly, not for drama, but because it had to. Arnold looked at Jasmine. His voice didn't shift in volume. It didn't rise or drop. But the rhythm slowed, and the words carried an edge honed by something older than politics. In 1997, a 7th grade girl at Mark Twain Middle School was suspended for an altercation in the cafeteria. It wasn't self-defense. She struck another girl twice in the face. The second blow broke a molar. The girl needed dental reconstruction. Jasmine blinked once, then twice. Her face didn't change yet, but something behind her eyes did. John leaned forward. Arnold continued. The incident was recorded, but the footage never left the district. The girl who filed the complaint didn't press charges. The administration was prepared to expel the student. The pause that followed felt cold. Arnold's hand slid the folded paper across the table, stopping it just inches from Jasmine's fingers. I signed the letter that erased the record. John looked between them, speechless. Jasmine didn't reach for the letter. Arnold added, not because you deserved it, because you were 12. And I knew what 12-year-olds look like when the system gives up on them. The audience had stopped reacting. No whispers, no shifting in seats. Even the lights seemed to dim on their own. Jasmine's voice, when it returned, was smaller. You're saying that girl was me? Arnold didn't answer. He didn't need to. John finally spoke, his voice cautious. Wait, Governor, are you saying Jasmine was a student in that report? Arnold nodded once, slowly. And the other girl? Jasmine asked, even more quietly. Arnold looked at her. My daughter. The silence detonated without sound. He continued. She was my foster daughter. Her name is Mei Lin. She was 10, and she never told anyone, not even me. I found out 2 weeks later. And when I asked her if she wanted me to press charges, she said no. She looked like she needed help. Jasmine's mouth parted, but no words came. Her hands, folded all night in controlled elegance, now open and rested on the table, empty, uncertain. Arnold looked out toward the audience, but his voice stayed grounded in her direction. I made one phone call, to keep your name off a file, not because I wanted thanks, Because I believed you'd grow into someone who could make that choice for someone else one day. He stood slowly, not for effect, for closure. And you did. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't explain further. He left the paper on the table. Jasmine didn't touch it. She didn't cry, but her eyes did not follow him out. They stayed on the letter, like a mirror she wasn't sure she wanted to face. John reached for his cue cards, but there was nothing left to read. No follow-up question fit. No break could soften what had just unfolded. A student in the third row whispered, not for the mic, not for the camera, just loud enough to be heard. He saved her, and she didn't know. Jasmine finally looked up. Her voice didn't rise. I didn't remember. And Arnold was already gone. She didn't remember. But now no one could forget. The studio no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a courtroom without a verdict, a sanctuary stripped of applause. The audience wasn't reacting. They were absorbing. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her shoulders no longer squared for debate. Her fingers hovered above the folded paper, as if touching it would make everything too real, too fast. Jon Stewart didn't speak. His cue cards rested on the table like relics from a different show, one that had ended quietly and without permission. The overhead lights had dimmed ever so slightly, not by design, but as if the room itself understood the weight of what had been said. No one had expected the hero of the night to walk offstage without raising his voice. No one had expected Jasmine to sit in silence, surrounded by the very system she had come to indict. And no one knew what to do now. A full 10 seconds passed before the producer whispered in John's earpiece. He gave a slight nod, then turned toward the audience. We're going to stay live, he said softly, because sometimes silence is a story. Jasmine looked up. Her expression had changed. No longer defiant, no longer guarded. There was no script for this version of her, only memory. I was 12, she said, not for the camera, but to herself. I thought I got away with it. She looked around the room, not for approval, not for rescue, just searching for something to anchor to. I had blocked it out, she continued. I told myself it was self-defense, that it wasn't that bad, that the school just overreacted. Her voice didn't crack. It slowed. But now I remember. She was smaller than me, and she didn't hit back. John leaned forward, elbows on the table, but said nothing. The cameras didn't cut away. They stayed wide, letting the moment stretch. Jasmine gestured toward the letter. He knew. All these years, he knew, and he never said a word. A pause. And I came here ready to bury him with sound bites. A soft rustle came from the back row as a woman stood. Quietly, slowly. She looked like she didn't want attention, but the camera found her anyway. It was Mei Lin. She didn't speak. She didn't wave. She just nodded, once, toward Jasmine. Jasmine exhaled. I thought I was the only one who carried it. Turns out, I was the only one who forgot. John finally spoke. There's a word for that. Grace. Jasmine looked at him, tired but steady. No, that's not what this is. She turned back toward Mei Lin. This is mercy. Mei Lin didn't react. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. Jasmine turned again, this time facing the crowd. I made a career out of being the one who remembers injustice. But I think the most dangerous thing I ever did was forget the damage I caused when I was the one holding power. She reached forward and finally touched the letter. She didn't open it, just felt the paper's weight beneath her palm. The show had no script for what came next. The audience didn't clap. The host didn't pivot. The silence remained, not heavy, not hollow, but full, not of shame, not of blame, but of something else, something sacred, a kind of quiet only truth could earn. The lights hadn't changed, but the room no longer felt lit. It felt bare, as if something sacred had been revealed, and now nothing else wanted to be seen too brightly. Jasmine Crockett remained seated at the table, her hand still resting on the folded letter, as if it held a weight her voice couldn't carry yet. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was an echo, and everyone had heard it. Jon Stewart cleared his throat softly, not to speak, but to prove he still could. He looked at her and then at the camera, then back again, waiting to see if the moment needed him. It didn't. Jasmine slowly leaned back, but not into comfort. It was the posture of someone absorbing something irreversible. For a long time, she had worn pain as proof. Proof that she understood the broken system. Proof that she had survived it. But now, she had become part of the very equation she had spent years trying to solve. And the answer had changed. She didn't apologize. That would have been easy. That would have been expected. She stayed silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because for once, silence wasn't avoidance. It was accountability. In the second row, someone coughed, then stopped mid-breath. Not out of illness, out of fear they'd break whatever spell held the room together. Finally, John asked gently, "Do you want to say anything to him?" Jasmine didn't look at him. Her eyes had drifted toward the side of the stage where Arnold had exited minutes ago. She didn't know if he was still behind the curtain or halfway down the street. That was the thing about people like him. They could disappear without ever leaving. "I think he said enough," she replied. "And I think I've said too much." She paused. Her voice steadied, not because she found strength, but because she stopped fighting the weight. "I came here to expose him, to demand an explanation. But the truth is, I had one moment of violence, and he protected me from being defined by it. I've had 20 years of speeches, and tonight I almost defined him by one decision." She looked out into the audience now, making eye contact not with cameras, but with faces. We talk about systems like they're monsters, but they're made of choices and people. And sometimes the ones we want to tear down are the same people who made room for us when no one else did. The room didn't move. She turned toward the camera, not with defiance, not with shame, but with clarity. "Tonight, I remembered the worst version of myself. And it turns out, he remembered it, too. But instead of punishing me, he chose to believe there was a better version coming." She sat back again, breath held, as if the admission might burn on its way out. And I never gave him the same grace. There was no applause, just the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be filled. From backstage, a subtle creak was heard. The audience turned, hoping. But it wasn't Arnold. It was just a stagehand adjusting a light. Jasmine smiled faintly at the sound. It was the first time her face had softened all night. "That's fitting," she said quietly. "He leaves the stage and lets the rest of us decide what we want to become in the aftermath." John leaned in, still letting her lead. "And what do you want to become?" She thought for a moment, eyes locked on nothing. Someone who stops mistaking volume for truth. Someone who doesn't just fight back, but knows when to sit still and face what she's forgotten. The camera panned slowly across the room, faces stunned into stillness, the weight of the conversation hanging over them like smoke from a fire no one had seen start. There was no segment break, no jingle, just a moment held open long enough for everyone watching to realize it wasn't a show anymore. Jasmine folded the letter once more and placed it in her lap, not as evidence, not as proof, as memory. And just before the feed cut, she spoke one more time. "If he's watching, thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't see it until now." Then she looked down. The letter stayed folded. The silence stayed earned. The studio lights began to soften, not by design, but by timing. The program had technically ended 5 minutes ago, but no one had moved. Jon Stewart hadn't delivered his usual closing line. The teleprompter froze somewhere in the second paragraph of a wrap-up that no longer applied. There was nothing left to promote, nothing left to defend. Jasmine Crockett sat with the letter still in her lap, both hands resting on it now, not to protect it, but to hold still a version of herself that no longer made sense. A producer gestured from behind the camera, but John ignored it. He knew better than to try and steer a moment that had already decided its own path. Instead, he turned his mic down slightly and leaned closer to Jasmine, not as a host, but as a person still catching his breath. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Jasmine nodded, but it wasn't a yes. It was a gesture that simply meant, "I heard you." She looked toward the side of the stage again. Arnold hadn't returned. No one had seen him since he walked out after naming the girl. He had spoken his truth, then left it behind like a judge placing the gavel and stepping down, not to leave, but to let others carry the ruling themselves. Backstage, Arnold stood just beyond the curtain. His posture was unchanged, arms loosely behind his back, eyes fixed on the monitor feeding the live broadcast. He didn't need to be seen to be present. He had lived long enough to know that impact often came not from what you said, but from when you chose to stop speaking. A stagehand noticed him and froze. Arnold nodded once, not as greeting, but permission to keep moving. The young man passed quickly, unsure whether he had just crossed through something sacred. Back inside the studio, a rustle of movement finally came from the audience. Not people leaving, just shifting slowly, like a room exhaling after being held still for too long. Someone in the second row reached for a water bottle and then put it back down without drinking. A student near the aisle whispered something to her friend and immediately looked down. The spell wasn't broken. It had just changed shape. Jasmine straightened slightly and adjusted her blazer. The motion was instinctive, mechanical. Her voice, when she spoke again, wasn't the same voice that had started the program. I used to think redemption was something loud, she said, almost to herself. A campaign, a headline, a protest. She paused, letting the sentence hover before landing softly. But maybe it's just a man who walks away before you realize he was the one who kept you standing. The audience didn't clap. They couldn't. The silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. No one wanted to be the first to ruin what had been built by restraint. John leaned back in his chair, hands clasped together. Do you think you would have become who you are without that moment? Without him? Jasmine didn't answer right away. Then she shook her head, slowly. I think I would have become someone else. Still loud, still angry, but not as useful. She turned to face the crowd, and this time she looked not for sympathy, but for responsibility. We all carry things we pretend we forgot, moments we rewrite because the truth doesn't fit the version of us we've built for the world. I buried a version of me that hurt someone and told myself I was protecting a bigger cause, but I was really protecting myself. Someone in the third row wiped their eyes, not because it was sad, but because something familiar had just been named aloud. Jasmine continued, voice steady now. When I was 12, he didn't see a criminal. He saw a scared kid who made a terrible decision. And instead of making me pay for it, he made sure I had another chance to be someone better. She paused. And I just spent the last year building a platform to tear him down. John didn't speak. The silence did it for him. Jasmine looked at the floor, then at the lights, then back toward the side of the stage. I don't think he wanted forgiveness. I think he wanted to see if I could recognize mercy when it came back around. Backstage, Arnold stepped away from the monitor, not to return, just to stop watching. He had already seen everything he needed to. A producer stepped beside him, whispering, Do you want to rejoin the table for the end? Arnold shook his head once. No, the ending's hers now. Inside the studio, Jasmine gathered the letter and stood. The audience instinctively stood with her, not as applause, but as respect. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't wave. She just stood long enough for everyone to understand that she was walking off stage, not as a politician, not as a survivor, but as someone who had finally remembered who had given her a second beginning. And when she walked out, she didn't look back, because this time she didn't need to. The next morning, the headlines didn't scream. There were no viral edits with dramatic zoom-ins, no thumbnails in red font with faces circled. The show didn't trend for controversy. It didn't break algorithms. It broke something else, quietly, a pattern, a cycle, a way of speaking about power, without remembering who gave it. Clips began circulating not from the network, but from viewers. One video, titled, She Forgot Who Saved Her, had no intro, no commentary. It started with Jasmine's fingers hovering over the folded letter and ended with her words. Maybe you just wanted to see if I'd recognize mercy when it came back around. It was less than 2 minutes long. It was shared over 1 million times before the end of the day. In a classroom in Atlanta, a civics teacher played the segment and said nothing afterward. Instead, she wrote one sentence on the board. Who protected your future without needing you to know? No one answered out loud. But a few students stayed behind after class, not to talk, just to sit with it. At a community college in Oakland, a criminal justice professor paused his lecture and told his students, "I've taught about systems for 20 years. Last night, I saw a man opt out of being one." He didn't elaborate. He just played the tape. In a modest apartment in Dallas, a woman in her 30s watched the full interview 3 times in a row. She didn't work in politics. She didn't follow policy. But she remembered a cafeteria, a broken tooth, a moment of silence that followed her for years. Her name wasn't Jasmine. She hadn't gone on to become anyone known, but she sent an email to a private address that night. No subject line, just the words, "I remember her now. I forgive her. Thank you for not making me explain." In Sacramento, the staff of a local nonprofit left a copy of the folded letter on the front desk. Not the real one, just a symbol. Below it was a sign, "Mercy, not mythology." Arnold didn't release a statement. His team didn't schedule interviews. He didn't go on a podcast or give a follow-up comment to clarify his actions. He had already said what needed saying. He had walked off stage with the same silence he walked in with, and that silence had done more than any monologue could. He spent the day the same way he spent most days now, off camera, walking trails and hills just outside the city. A staffer texted him updates throughout the afternoon. He didn't respond. At sunset, he looked out at the ridgeline and whispered something no one else heard. She saw it. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was recognition. That's all he'd ever wanted. Later that night, Jon Stewart posted one sentence to his personal account. No tags. No hashtags. Just this, "I think we all owe someone silent." By midnight, the phrase had become a kind of echo, quoted, reposted, scribbled on post-it notes above desks and coffee makers, in spaces where people had forgotten who got them through something. Not because they were ungrateful, but because they had never been told. Jasmine didn't appear on any shows the next day. She didn't issue a tweet. But on her website, without fanfare or press release, a single photo was uploaded. It showed a folded letter on a desk, beside a broken piece of school chalk and a faded yearbook photo of 2 girls, one looking straight into the camera, the other looking away. No caption. It wasn't for likes. It wasn't for headlines. It was for memory. Somewhere in Los Angeles, May Lynn closed her office early. She didn't need to explain. Her clients had seen the clip. One of them left a card at the front desk with a message. "Thank you for showing up for people who once forgot they hurt you." Inside the CNN studio, the production crew kept the stage quiet for the rest of the week. They didn't book new guests. They didn't reset the lights. The wooden table remained untouched, as if the space still held something not to be erased by new topics. When a junior tech suggested dismantling it for the next panel, the senior producer shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "Let it sit." In a church basement in St. Louis, a pastor used a story for his Sunday sermon. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. "There's a kind of forgiveness," he told his congregation, "that isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just waits until the one who's been forgiven is strong enough to see it." Arnold didn't attend that service, but someone sent him a clip. He watched it once in full and then pressed pause before the final hymn. Not to rewind, but to remember. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not be remembered for what you did, but for what you chose never to reveal. The letter remained folded. Weeks passed. The news cycle moved on. Politicians returned to arguing over funding and curriculum. Town halls filled with new slogans. Debates picked up where they had left off. But the moment didn't vanish. It stayed quiet, tucked in the corners of memory, not because anyone asked it to be remembered, but because no one who saw it could forget. In a university media class, a professor assigned the full broadcast as required viewing, not for the policy points, not for the historical references, but for the silence. The assignment came with one question: who walked off that stage with the most power? A student wrote, "The one who said the least." Another wrote, "The one who never needed to be right." In a neighborhood library in South Dallas, a woman approached the front desk and asked if they had a copy of the school board records from 1997. She said she used to be a teacher. She didn't say what she was looking for, but when the clerk offered to help, she just smiled and said, "No, I think I finally understand." In a small studio apartment, Jasmine sat alone on a Sunday morning. The folded letter sat on the table where she had placed it 2 weeks earlier. She hadn't opened it, not because she was afraid of what was inside, but because she already knew the truth had arrived without needing proof. The sun cast long shadows across the kitchen tile as she walked to the window. Outside, a child passed by with a backpack too big for his frame. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. She had already seen him. She turned back toward the table and picked up the letter, not to read it, but to move it. She placed it in a drawer and closed it gently, not to forget, but to let it rest. That afternoon, she spoke at a school board meeting, unscheduled, unplanned, just a visitor with a name people now recognize differently. She didn't mention the broadcast. She didn't quote statistics. She just told one story about a girl who made a mistake, about another girl who never asked for an apology, about a man who chose to be quiet when it would have been easier to speak. The room listened, not because she demanded it, but because she no longer needed them to. When she finished, an older woman at the back of the room raised her hand. She didn't ask a question. She just said, "I've been in education for 35 years, and I've never seen someone carry truth the way you just did." Jasmine nodded. "That's because it wasn't mine. I was only borrowing it." Outside the building, a local journalist waited. He asked for a comment. Jasmine paused and answered, "If you need a headline, write this. Sometimes the most dangerous version of us isn't the one who's angry. It's the one who forgot why she was angry in the first place." The next morning, Arnold received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. Inside were only 10 words. "I finally remembered what I owed you. Thank you, sir." He didn't frame it. He didn't reply. He folded it twice and placed it inside the same drawer where he had kept the original expulsion letter all these years. He had never needed it to prove anything. It had always been a reminder. That same day, May Lynn received a message from a private account. It was short. "I never forgot your face. I only forgot the weight of it. I'm sorry." She didn't respond, but she saved it. In the months that followed, clips of the confrontation resurfaced in quiet places, not on trending pages, but in college forums, in training programs for school counselors, in support groups for formerly incarcerated youth. It became a case study, not policy, but presence. One educator in Chicago began her semester with the clip. After it finished, she turned to her students and asked, "What did he teach you without speaking?" The answers varied, but one stuck. That sometimes protecting someone means letting them forget what you did for them until they're ready to remember it for themselves. Arnold never returned to the show. He never wrote a memoir about the event. But the studio kept the table where it happened. They replaced the backdrop. They upgraded the lights. But the table stayed. The letter, of course, was gone. In its place, a plaque was added under the surface. No names, no explanation, just one line. "Mercy doesn't need a microphone." And no one ever tried to sit in that seat again.